Thank you, Rama. First of all, salam and lal salam to everyone on International Working Women's Day. There seems to be something a little bit reductive and tokenistic about having one day in a year marked for women. Lots of people have been asking, what about the other 364? But this is in fact not International Women's Day, it is International Working Women's Day. And there is a crucial difference there which speaks to a gendered nation. And I will come back to that soon. Sharmila Rege, a scholar of Dalit feminism, who passed away 3 years ago, had given a blueprint for a contemporary Indian classroom which she called the Phule Ambedkarite pedagogical practice, a feminist Dalit teaching practice. In it, one of her maxims was the interrogation of the teacher as God or Savior, and the conducting of the classroom as an interactive space instead of playing out as a teaching-learning hierarchy. But then Rege's scholarship has been contested as coming from a Brahminical voice, speaking of and for the Dalits by Dalit feminist scholars who have not had the same opportunities, space, or exposure in academia. For example, the many pieces in Roundtable India, like the one by Lata Pratibha Madhukar, on the side streaming as opposed to the mainstreaming of Dalit Bahujan women writers. This is only a small indicator of what we need to be conscious of, I think, as we think about the implications of Women's Day for gender and our nation, such as it may be, the million mutinies and the interrogations, the contestations and the fragmentations of identity and territory. Even while holding on to that awareness, I wanted to invoke the idea of the more equitable space of learning and arguing that Rege had proposed, as Jacques Rancière actually had also in another way talked of in his book, The Ignorant Schoolmaster. So what we had thought of today was, rather than the regular lecture for the teach-in and the question and answer, Sanjay and I will start off this session by flagging a few possible points of departure, and then we hope to have an engaged discussion that can address these and other thoughts that everyone brings to the floor. So we'd like to actually flag a different kind of program for this hour. But before, so the way we've divided it is that I'll talk a little bit about the background for the Working Women's Day, and also how one can extend it perhaps to the possibility of a queer working day, perhaps. And Sanjay will talk specifically about masculinities and nationalisms. We know, I think, that this day commemorates a ladies' garments workers' union strike in America on March 8, 1857. So the Working Women's Day began as a socialist political event, and that is really important. I'm not sure how and why the working part of it fell off, perhaps in order to depoliticize the day, because labor is one of the key areas that all gender questions must address. So the first International Working Women's Day was commemorated almost more than 100 years ago, organized by the Socialist Party of America in remembrance of the garment workers' strike, and subsequently became very significant in the Soviet bloc and finally spread to many parts of the world. So what does it mean today to extend this idea of the International Working Women's Day to talking about what is the rubric for today, gender and nation, here and now? To begin with, there is no monolithic category called women, neither among those who identify biologically, socially, or politically as women, nor as a part of the larger rubric of gender. There is no monolithic entity called nation either. The nation is constituted of its fragments, continually aligning and de-aligning, contested and combative. And work is, of course, unequal in recognition and pay, in gender terms as also in terms of caste, class, location, and sexualities. So the only way we can usefully talk about Working Women's Day now is as a complex marker of contestations and fragmentations, both as gender and nation, and as a gendered nation. Pijra, the group that works from Delhi University demanding equal rights for women on campuses and hostels, has restored the name of this day to Working Women's Day. I think that this first step, if we are to mark Women's Day as a separate day, we must go back to its origins in factory women workers' strikes. This is important and urgent. So my salute to Pijra on this day. We can begin this day by talking about inequalities in women's work, its pay and conditions, of course, since that is still very much moot. According to a study released yesterday, up to 43% of Indian women of working age only do domestic work, which is approximately 153 million women. This is the informal sector where there is no protected pay scales or perks. Along with domestic workers, other exploited working women, construction laborers, farm and factory workers, sex workers, ad hoc teachers. But not only women make up these categories, which is why we have to talk about gendered inequalities in work depending upon other defining, intersecting, hyphenated identities of all workers. So at base, Women's Day is not for flowers and gifts for women we love and admire, not an Archie's festival, that is, but for women who are unknown, marginalized, exploited, silenced in the work they do. Then we would have to talk about women and marginalization, discrimination, rape, violence, and harassment. Since we are in a university space, we should also talk about how these are in operation on campuses. I would like to hear about those. But we should first recognize ourselves as privileged in this space that we are standing in, whether women or not, whatever identity we carry, and in this space, some of us are much more privileged than others. There is a lot of criticism, which I think is well warranted, outside JNU today about how JNU has established itself as an exceptional space in what has happened over this one month here. There is scathing anger about this exceptionalism, and instead of being dismissive or defensive about these questions, I would rather that they be accepted and used to think about our location and situation and privileges more sharply and more critically. How does this relate to questions of gender in the nation? Quite crucially, I would say. Because discriminated gender, which is what Working Women's Day is about, must talk about alliances and solidarities and differences and inequalities with other marginalized groups. So in thinking about gender, we must first interrogate any state of exceptionalism that we may find ourselves in. The marginalized have no claim to any kind of jingoism and privilege, and the most important questions about gender are vested in the marginalized, not in the privileged. And so we have to talk about inequalities among women, with and among men, other genders, and of course LGBT identities. In each of these porous categories, we have to think about femininities and masculinities and asexualities, caste, class, workers who are disenfranchised, laborers, contract workers, adjunct workers, sex workers, transgenders, and students. Women's Day could aim at becoming a gendered marginalities day, perhaps, working closely and completely with men, women, third gender, gender queer, which brings us to the possibility of another sedition charge upon us around Section 377, decriminalized in 2009 and then recriminalized in 2013. On International Working Women's Day, then, we must especially stand up against 377, which makes us all seditious all over again if the IPC stands for the Indian nation, and which means, to use a tired term now perhaps, that we may need to queer Women's Day in order to complicate it. This is not to say that Women's Day as a marker of specific oppressions of women is no longer relevant. We all know that if anything, it is more relevant than ever before, because a capitalist, developmentalist nationalism targets women viciously and wishes to both wreak violence upon them and invisibilize them at the same time. Some more than others, like Dalit women, poor women, lower-class women, non-heteronormative women. So we must see Working Women's Day in connection with all the other marginalized workers who may or may not have days assigned to themselves. Women as a unilateral category means nothing except as a metaphor. But the metaphor must transform to stand for contestations, not just between women and patriarchal forces outside of them, but within an expanded understanding of the term itself. just like nation is a contested space within and in itself, not just at its mapped and zoned borders. I'd like to end my little bit here today with a poem by Imtiaz Dharkar, who is a Pakistani poet. The poem is called Battle Line, and I think she brings together the question of gender and nation very politically here. Battle Line. Did you expect dignity? All you see is bodies crumpled carelessly and thrown away. And arms and legs are never arranged heroically. It's the same with lovers after the battle lines are drawn. Combatants thrown into something they have not had time to understand. Into something, and in the end, just a reflex turning away when there is nothing really left to say. When the body becomes a territory, shifting across uneasy sheets. When you retreat behind the borderline of skin. Turning, barbed wire sinking in. These two countries lie hunched against each other, distrustful lovers who have fought bitterly and turned their backs, but in sleep drifted slowly in, molding themselves around the cracks to fit together, whole again and at peace, forgetful of hostilities, until in the quiet dawn, the next attack. Thank you.
Thank you. और इंटरनेशनल वर्किंग वुमेन्स डे पे हम सबको मुबारकबाद। I want to talk specifically about masculinity and nationalism. हालांकि हम जेंडर की बात करते हैं, लेकिन जेंडर का असली मतलब होता है एक रिश्ता between men and women, between men and men, between people who don't recognize themselves as either men and women. So I want to just briefly provide a non-theoretical history of masculinity and nationalism. From the end of 19th century to now. So I will begin with some brief comments about the connection between nationalism and masculinity, and end with what I want to call what I want to refer to in the current what's happening to masculinity now. The idea of the strong man as the political leader of the country, and how do we understand current forms of masculinity. And so let me just begin. And I won't read out like Brinda. I have these in order to just prompt myself. So I think it's important to understand nationalism not only as a political project, not simply and straightforwardly as a political project, but as a cultural project. So my discussion as a sociologist is about the cultural project of nationalism. और फिर मर्दानगी को nationalism के साथ कैसे जोड़ के देखा जाए, इसके बारे में थोड़ा मैं बोलना चाहता हूँ. So firstly, then, why study masculinity? Right? Why would you not just be satisfied with what feminism has taught us about patriarchy? Let me begin by saying that masculinity is a relationship not only between men and women, but also between men and men. And that is what men need to recognize, that whereas patriarchy produces all men as superior to all women, masculinity is a process of producing some men as superior to not only all women, but also to some men, right? That is a crucial difference. So masculinity studies that is inspired by feminism is then an attempt to look at the relationship not only between men and men, but also, not only the relationship between men and women, but also men and men. Because there are men, for example, if you only have daughters, you may not be considered as man enough as someone who has sons, and hence that's of particular significance certainly to our part of the world. If you don't work, for example, you may not be as man enough as someone who works. If you don't have, in quotation marks, control over your house, जैसे कि आप अपने, मैं सब quotation marks में डाल रहा हूँ कि अपने घर की औरतों के ऊपर अगर आपको काबू नहीं है, तो you're not as masculine as someone else who has control over the women of the house. And that is why it is important to think about masculinity as a particular kind of gender position, as a relationship which has historically, for our country at least, has had a very significant relationship with nationalism. And let me try and explain just a few points. So as someone has pointed out, if you really want to understand the field of power in which women have lived their lives as gendered beings, then it's important also to understand men as gendered beings. Otherwise, you produce manhood, maleness as a universal category. Right? You don't interrogate how is it, what investments that men have in building certain kinds of relationship with each other. How do they protect those investments? So it is for these reasons that I think it's really significant and important to study gender. As you know, for example, the gender politics of Indian modernity and nationalism has been studied in terms of has been studied as if women equal gender, which is a fair enough which is a fair enough historical trajectory, because after all, feminism has come has derived its impetus in many significant ways from activism. So in a similar way that we've studied ideas about, for example, chastity, ideas about tradition, ideas about home, ideas about the kinds of spaces that men belong, the kind of spaces that women occupy, we should also apply the same lens to the ideas of masculinity. Now, before I say anything, I think it's really important to understand that, people often say, "Arey, to theek hai," if men have certain spaces, after all, women also have their spaces, right? So we often tend to equate something called masculinity, something called femininity as equal and opposite terms. They are not equal and opposite terms. So the manner in which masculinity, manhood gets defined is because the manner in which something called femininity has been defined. So it's only if you define femininity as something that is supportive of certain kinds of masculinity that masculinity emerges as a superior category. So masculinity and femininity are not equal and opposed terms. They are in hierarchical relationship to each other. And that's also why it is important to think about how we understand this thing called masculinity, mardangi. Alag-alag bhashaon mein alag-alag shabd hai. Now, of course, as I said, so there are different kinds of masculinities, and the masculinity that there are, and usually the term that is used, masculinities. There's no one masculinity, right? There are different kinds of masculinities. There are heterosexual masculinities. There are non-heterosexual masculinities that have relationship to each other. And there, as Brinda was saying, and it's also very important to think about other terms, other concepts such as sexuality, and how to think about these things within the context of nationalism. How to think about sexuality in the context of masculinity and nationalism. So a very brief history, which will take me about 2 to 3 minutes, would be that so we've always had histories of masculinity in India. There were pre-colonial histories of masculinity. You have some martial masculinity which existed during the Mughal court, for example. Then you have very specific colonial histories of masculinities, right? So after 1857, certain groups, as I'm sure many of you know, were produced through the colonial power as martial races, not only in India but around the world. So Sikhs and Gurkhas after 1857 became produced as martial races, and of course these were often groups that were seen to have that were seen to have supported the British during the 1857. So other groups such as Bengalis, for example, as you know, were produced as non-masculine and effeminate groups. It is also important to think about masculinity, nationalism, sexuality. Well, not only because, as we know, there are 3,000 condoms that are found every day in jail. So, and I'm actually, frankly, disappointed in all of you. But anyway, let's leave that aside. And it's also important to think about it because a great deal of the connection between masculinity and nationalism that comes about derives from the colonial period in order to produce a certain kind of person who, the heterosexual national male hero, who takes on certain burdens that the British had themselves introduced in the colonial sphere. So Section 377 was also a kind of masculine anxiety about a loss of the masculine self. So there's a masculine self, the male self has sex with another man, that then quite clearly that self becomes, or one of that self becomes feminized self. Right? So it's important to think about how these ideas then become built into the national sphere. You then, as we kind of, if you then move on to think now about the post-colonial period. I just want to invoke for you one particular figure. Most of you are very young, younger. Most of you perhaps don't watch black and white from the 1950s and 60s. But if you look at one particular kind of nationalist figure in the 50s and 60s, he was usually a doctor, an engineer, a dam builder, right? Someone you could call the 5-year plan hero. There was a guy who was really the 5-year plan hero. Why? Because he embodied certain notions of masculinity and science. You know, like I did economics, my BA and MA. So when I discovered sociology and social anthropology, I think at least for my parents, at least even for my grandmother, that was the real loss of my own masculinity. But they said, you know, for God's sake, that economics has some amount of maths. You know, what does sociology offer? So disciplines are also masculine disciplines, and that is why, for example, the 5-year plan hero was always a scientist, right? He was a saver. He saved the nation. He saved for the nation. He built dams. He was a doctor. He was never a consumer, and that's been the great shift in the nationalist hero now. The nationalist hero now, the enemy of the nation now in Indian popular culture is the saver, not the consumer. The hero of the nation now is the consumer. Okay, so while, as I said to you, what happens in the colonial period, that this notion of a self-perception of effeteness, that Indians were effete people, as the British said, was accepted by the Indian nationalists. So many people, such as the Dayanand Saraswati, Vivekananda, for example, propagated the idea that indeed Indians, that there is evidence that we are not sort of feminine people, that we need to become more masculine. And these ideas then become built into our nationalist discourse. However, at the same time, if you remember, if you think of things like the Parsi theatre, the Marathi theatre, the most significant roles were, not the most significant roles, but almost all the roles of women were done by men. And this is not only because women were not allowed to do it. Many scholars have pointed out that there's often amongst the audience a preference, like an autoeroticism, for men performing women's roles. And one of the most Bal Gandharv was, of course, one of the most popular performers in the Parsi and Marathi theatre tradition. His images were on posters and handkerchiefs and matches, etc., etc. So there's also a preference for male performers who would perform women's roles. And it's important to think about what happens to that particular tradition. I'm not arguing that this is like a utopia of feminism of some sort, but I'm certainly suggesting that it's worthwhile thinking about the complexities of the kinds of gender identity that nationalism takes on board much later on. Now, let me then think about some of the topics that we all, nationalism is about and has been discussed with you in the last week or so, or last 10 days. One is the idea of religion, masculinity, and nationalism. Many of the 19th century upper caste Hindu nationalists came to believe that the emasculation, again I put this in inverted commas, of the Hindu people was in fact due to the long history of Muslim rule, and that this had to be somehow had to be an earlier pre-colonial masculinity had to be resuscitated. That had to be gone by. So religion has always been a very significant aspect in which masculinity and nationalism in India have come together, and you can hear echoes of this now. It's not anything new. And let me also then speak very briefly about caste. What happens in Maharashtra in the early 20th century is very strong eugenics movement, right? And Maharashtra was actually a very interesting place, because there was a very strong sexology movement, very strong eugenics movement, and many people started writing about eugenics, saying why eugenics is a good thing. And there the idea was that you must also remember in that part of India, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, there were also very strong anti-Brahmanical movements, right? So a lot of the eugenics movement that happens in Maharashtra and parts of Tamil Nadu, and many people start to justify saying why eugenics is necessary, gets built around one particular term that I remember one author, a Marathi author called N.S. Falke, using, was sexual swaraj. He said we need eugenics because it proves that our caste system has historically been a scientific way of organizing human society. That's what eugenics is. And we must also remember that at that particular point in time, there was, as I said, strong anti-caste movement. So the defense of the eugenics movement, which is also a defense of the caste system, was also a particular kind of masculine anxiety, upper caste masculine anxiety about the movements that are happening, that were happening against caste at that particular point in time. So there was a real concern about what is to be the nature of Indian masculinity after Swaraj is achieved. And this was a very serious and very detailed argument that was happening in many parts of Maharashtra. Then I've already talked about in the post-colonial period, what happens is one figure that becomes a strong nationalist figure is the 5-year plan hero. Also, let me just point out to you one particular aspect that most of you remember the heroes of the 1950s and 60s. So if you remember heroes like Dilip Kumar, for example, If you remember heroes, like even when in the Raj Kapoor, not in his younger days but later, most of the heroes of Hindi film heroes 1950s, 60s, if you think about what masculinity means now, did not actually look like masculine figures. They were not muscular, right? And then they were in fact quite portly. And I think there's a specific reason for that, which has again to be linked to how that particular kind of 5-year plan hero was also linked to caste. Because to be muscular in the 1950s and 60s would mean someone who worked with their hands, right? To be lean would mean someone who worked with their hands. So the natural default position of the 5-year plan hero, which everyone automatically recognized, was as an upper caste person, because you had to look as if you did not work with your hands. So the different cultural ways in which nationalism, masculinity have been really significant in a culture, in the life of this nation. The 5-year plan hero, as you know, kind of declines in the late 1970s with the rise of Amitabh Bachchan as the lean hero, as the anti-state hero, as the provincial man who comes to the city to take part in parts of consumption. Let me now come to the present, because I want to end as quickly as possible, so that if you would like any points of discussion, perhaps we can have that. I want now to point to the current state. How do we understand masculinity and nationalism? Let me refer to this particular way of looking at masculinity as Modi masculinity. By which I mean that, firstly, the 5-year plan hero is gone. So the notion of the national hero will save for the nation, that has gone. So you have now a rise of consumer culture. You have, consumerism is that process where everyone is invited to consume, right? Men, women, so capital doesn't care, right? And yet, historically in India at least, the woman has never been the consumer, right? She's always been, cultural discourse, always been the sacrificer, someone who will eat after the brothers and fathers have eaten, someone who will save for the nation, who will never consume, right? So consumerism is also a period which invites everyone to consume, and yet it also causes a certain kind of masculine anxiety, because the consuming woman in the Indian context is a very new figure, right? The woman who spends on herself, the young woman who hangs out in shopping malls, the woman who earns and spends for herself, the working woman, as Brinda was pointing out. Now, I think what the current, the manner in which we could perhaps try and think about masculinity and nationalism in terms of what I've referred to as Modi masculinity is the rise of a figure who promises both the world but also control over the home. So no one does not want consumption, no one does not want more fridges, cars, overseas travel, and I think the strong political figure now that we have, and you remember in the election campaign, even his opponents started to talk about him in terms of his masculineness, if only to dispute him. I remember, I think Salman Khurshid said once that he was actually an apunsak, impotent man, because he could not stop the Gujarat riots. So even whilst people were trying to oppose Narendra Modi in his election campaign, they were actually discussing him in the coin that his own party wanted him to be discussed. So they were discussing him as more or less masculine, but masculine nevertheless, right? So I think what we have right now is a particular kind of connection between masculinity and nationalism in the form of the strong political leader who says, I will give you the world, but simultaneously, I will make sure that Indian traditions are maintained. So you can be a person of the world, but also maintain control over the home. So I think that's another way perhaps we might think about how in the current period, what the relationships are between masculinity and nationalism. And that particular discourse, also appeals not only to Indians within India, but also diasporic Indians. The notion of, I think what the current form of masculinity does is combines a deterritorialized nationalism, you can be a global Indian citizen, but also reinforces all those very ideas of tradition, chastity, and man controlling the home that have been with us for a long time. So I'm not giving you a sort of a straight linear history of masculinity and nationalism, but to think about how do older ideas come back to us? How do older ideas become reinvented in a new context? So how do we understand the connection between masculinity and nationalism in the current period, which is not characterized by the savings ethic, right? My parent generation, perhaps many of your parent generation. How do we think about nationality in the context where the consumer is the national hero? And yet that consumerism, as I said to you, also causes certain forms of masculine anxieties about women, the woman as a consumer. So how do you tackle that at the level of the culture? So that how do you say that you can have the world, because that's what it is to be global, but also we will not allow that globalism, we will not allow those various flows and processes that are part of globalism to threaten your control of the home. So just to end then, I think, so what I've referred to as Modi masculinity offers both the possibilities of worldliness, but also the idea that within this new nationalism, men may control to have control of the home. So these are just some of the ways I think it's important to think of nationalism as a cultural project, because ultimately nationalism, as it falls out, when it appeals to people, it is on the cultural sphere, right? It's not so much that people actually sit down and talk about the economics of nationalism or the politics of nationalism. They do that, but the most frequent discussions around tea shops, around in homes, in classrooms, in your hostel rooms, etc., is about how culturally to understand what is this thing called nationalism. So I'll end with saying that I think perhaps one of the current ways of thinking about nationalism is that we must think about the connection that is increasingly made between offering you the world, by you I mean men in particular, but also offering you that promise that you may you may continue to control the home. So.
Thank you so much, sir. Now we can take a few questions. So those who have questions, they can raise your hand. Both.
Professor, you'd drawn upon the history of the International Working Women's Day, that the importance of labor in relation, and then you went on to say how we include the queer movement with. How do you link? How do you say in India today the link between labor and the queer movement is that developing? How would you look at that?
Thank you. That's a good question. I was thinking of it more in terms of the theoretical kind of linking of how in questions of labor there are all kinds of marginalized groups, so everybody doesn't get to, even with the same qualifications, you have so many other markers that allow you to access to certain kinds of work, pay, privileges, etc. And that within sexualities, I mean, these are all sort of intersecting categories. Queer also has a particular marginalized space, which then could reify or reinforce the double, triple marginalizations that every individual, in fact, works with. And the intersections differ, but queer has a particular kind of marginalization to work with, various other, caste, class, etc. So I was thinking in terms of how doubles and triples of identities then work to completely destabilize the possibility of equal work, equal pay.
और किसी के पास कोई सवाल हो या फिर डिस्कशन कुछ करना चाहता है, सवाल ना भी हो।
I just want to report something about Pinjara and in the light of what Brinda said about JNU exceptionalism. I think that it's very important to criticize oneself, and I hope that this will remain both an internally self-critical space. But there is something that this space contributes, which is clearly disturbing many people. Pinjara actually asked me to come to Jamia to have what should be something that should make everybody very happy, gender in the nation. I guess it was supposed to be outside Begum Anis Kidwai, my grandmother's hostel, was a hostel named after my grandmother. She wrote a book and actually worked during partition for the abducted women. And that was denied. And the reason it was denied was that we do not want JNU culture. And they've asked me to publicize it, right? So this is not an advertisement for myself, but so there is something about the, if you want, let's make a word, a bebakness of JNU culture, which is truly, I think, exceptional. And but it should not produce exceptionalism, as you said. There are many questions that we want to discuss. Many of those, I mean, like just the one question that you had today, where I was something just right now, what was the same question that I also wanted to put up for discussion. If this day is International Working Women's Day, he's referring to a sex identity, right? And a sex and a labor identity, not a gender and a work identity, if you want. Other people may not have this day. But does the fact that this day just refers only to women, does that primary contradiction, if you want, in patriarchal society, do we need to vanish it to be able to say, to be able to maintain the fact that you have to have intersectionality? Women's Day, I think, means a lot just for the fact that it Working Women's Day means a lot because it recognizes one half or slightly less than one half of the population. Intersectionality can be something that this Women's Day does, and so movement from working women to Women's Day presumably does that. Right? But is it important? Because there are a lot of discussions right now where the specificity of women's oppression is being questioned, and I wonder what both of you thought about it. Similarly with the question, I completely agree with you with Sanjay about the question of what is masculinities and Modi masculinities and all the forms. But somewhere in our theoretical practice, is it the case that we deny this is not a theoretical day? This is a day for women to shout loudly Azadi. Are we producing, Kanhaiya said this in his speech earlier, that somewhere we fail to be able to make those contradictions. We don't fail to distinguish between a basic contradiction and a one which is, of course, and the intersectional consideration. So I was wondering what not you do, because I was thinking what other people thought about it. Because it's important to understand what do we mean by having a Women's Day. If anybody has any comments, that would be nice.
Mike.
मतलब आज तो वुमेन्स डे है, मतलब इंटरनेशनल वुमेन्स डे, ठीक है। तो मैं इससे एक ही क्वेश्चन पूछना चाह रहा हूँ कि वर्किंग वुमेन, ठीक है, या वर्ल्ड वाटर इन वुमेन, जो जितनी सारी वुमेन मतलब पूरी वर्ल्ड की बात करते हैं, जो सिर्फ पानी के लिए लड़ रही है, जो अपने को वर्कर के साथ लड़ रहे हैं, जो अपने बॉस का भी वुमेन ही बॉस हो सकता है, मे बी मैन और वुमेन, दैट डजंट मैटर एट ऑल। तो जब तक ये वुमेन जो भी है, मतलब मैन आदमी हो या औरत, जब तक उनमें सुपरियरिटी रहेगी कि हाँ मैं तुम्हारा बॉस हूँ और मैं तुम्हें जो चाहता हूँ या जो मैं तुमसे करवाना चाहता हूँ वही तुम करोगे, तब तक ये खत्म हो सकता है क्या? क्वेश्चन मेरा एक है कि वुमेन है सारे
Mike.
it's not going to come to an end easily. I think the fight will carry on, but the intention is to try and reduce the inequalities. That is what the fight is for. I'm not sure that we have, I mean, of course there will always be hierarchies, but is that what you're asking? That is there a way that we can it be replaced by? Matriarchy. Oh, I'm not sure that that is the answer. I don't think so.
खास मुझे उसमें कोई जोड़ना नहीं है। अब हमारे हालांकि लोग कहते हैं कभी भी हमारे समाज में ऐतिहासिक तौर पे कभी मेट्रियार्कल सोसाइटी कभी हुई नहीं है, मेट्रीलिनियल हुई है। इसका मतलब कि आप अपने माँ की तरफ से आपका अपना वंश देख सकते हैं, लेकिन मेट्रियार्की का मतलब होता है पावर से होता है, सत्ता से होता है। मेट्रियार्कल सोसाइटी कभी हुई नहीं है और लिंग के रिश्तों में सत्ते के मामले के बारे में सोचना जरूरी है, क्योंकि ये भी कहना गलत नहीं है कि महिलाएं भी जो सत्ता के प्रदर्शन होती हैं उनका बर्ताव भी पुरुषों का हो सकता है। तो ये वास्तव में ये मुद्दा है सत्ता के बारे में, सत्ता के बारे में सोचा जाए वो ज़्यादा बेहतर है। और मेट्रियार्कल सोसाइटी कभी हमारे समाज से इतिहास तक कभी हुई नहीं है। तो सत्ता को कैसे बदलें, जो भी सत्ता में है उससे किस प्रकार के सवाल किए जाएं और वो सवालों से क्या बदलाव आ सकता है, इसके बारे में सोचें। चाहे वो पानी का सवाल हो, कपड़े का सवाल हो या सड़क का सवाल हो, तो ये वास्तव में ये मूल रूप से सत्ता का सवाल है, उसी के बारे में सोचना जरूरी है, ना कि मेट्रियार्कल या मेट्रियार्कल सोसाइटी।
Also because patriarchy has become a concept, right, rather than actually pertaining to man. So there are lots of women who are patriarchal. And as you were saying about a woman boss or a woman teacher maybe, or so it's the positioning that then gives a certain kind of power, and that we think of as patriarchal now, isn't it? So it's not so much a matriarch can be patriarchal as much as not being a woman. So I think it's more of a concept. It's not just a question of gender. Cis, as it's called, cisgender man, woman anymore.
मैं एक बात जोड़ना चाहता हूँ कि कई लोग कहते हैं कि so what कि if there are men bosses are bad to the employee, there are also women bosses. The two are not the same thing, because a woman in a position of power, there is no historical structure to support the position that she takes. But for men there is a historical structure. तो दोनों में फर्क है। ये कहना कि वुमेन बॉस और मेन बॉस दोनों में क्या फ़र्क है, तो आखिर दोनों तो डिस्क्रिमिनेट करते हैं, लेकिन फ़र्क ये है कि एक को एक अधिकार है, ऐतिहासिक तौर से अधिकार मिला है, तो दूसरे का अधिकार नहीं है। वो मतलब वो निजी तरह से वो अपना सत्ता वो इस्तेमाल कर रही है। तो ये भी एक फ़र्क है, इस फ़र्क को हमें सोचना चाहिए, नहीं तो बहुत ही आसान ये बड़े सवाल किए जाते हैं, अरे क्या फ़र्क पड़ता है, when there are women bosses who are bad, the men bosses who are bad. There is a difference. अगर इतिहास के बारे में सोचें तब, और ये सोचना ज़रूरी है, स्पेशली फेमिनिज्म आज के दिन।
It's not a question actually, sir. I want to just know, I'm not a student of political science or something. I come from environmental science. So this masculinity is like so deeply rooted in our society, even in the LGBT community. You find the either a gay couple or the lesbian couple, the one prefers to be the man, the one dresses like a man, both in gay and lesbian thing. So I think if I would love a woman, I would prefer her to be dressed like a woman only, and I'll be like a woman only. So I think this LGBT community should reject all these things. One has to be the male, powerful, and the protective one. Thank you.
One thing is that although we think that masculinity is a very masculinity is a very deep-rooted and strong identity, it's actually a very fragile identity, because it does not take anything to offend someone's masculinity. if you cut off someone driving in the car and you drive a motorcycle from the, masculinity is the most fragile of all gender identities because it takes nothing to offend someone's masculinity. It's not a deep identity at all. It's very important to understand that.
Alright, hi. So ma'am spoke about how capitalism has affected or has resulted in oppression of women. So I just wanted to clarify, isn't capitalism actually a globalization, and if globalization happens, doesn't it liberalize women further to an extent because we are exposed to various elements abroad? Basically, the women, we of course, we see equality and liberalism as a product of, so we look at girls in USA and we feel, okay, they are liberal, they are free. So isn't that actually contradictory that capitalism leads to liberalism, which is actually women empowerment? And my second question was that do you believe that so caste oppression supersedes patriarchal oppression, because is it actually just about economically weaker sections of society who have been oppressed, or is it actually about gender? Which one goes deeper? Two questions.
Thank you. Good and tough questions. Things that we are sort of trying to work through and battle. I think to begin with, I think I had to speak in sort of large generalizations, and of course the most important thing there is that we will have to consider specifics of cases, right? So whether it's a question of capitalism, because of course, globalization, capitalism offers all kinds of choices. You know, Sanjay was talking about the whole consumer kind of ethos that it has offered us. But we have to realize that, and we do realize that all of us don't have equal access to what the globalized world or the capitalist society is offering us. So it is liberal only to that extent that you know, it is where we are positioned at any given moment of time that will then determine how much we can take advantage of what the globalized world is offering us. So that's what I was meaning, that it's always intersect. And the same with, I mean, I'm not sure that, I think again it's to do with specific conditions of, you know, what caste, depending on which location, depending on how old you are, you know, depending on what kind of access you've had to education, etc. That would then work in conjunction with one's gender, so that a man in a particular position may actually be less powerful than a woman with certain similar kind of identities, but also differentials that will matter. So I think eventually, I guess this is what our research and teaching, you know, learning always teaches us, that we have to come down at some point, especially in the context of social and political conditions, to see what the specifics of a situation is. Yeah. So I'm sorry for having generalized, because you know, to some extent that this is what I was meaning. This was about the earlier, you know, the observation about dressing, you know, butch and femme kind of identities and dressing and behavior, right? I was thinking that this is a debate that has extended now to the question of marriage. Right, which has become, which is a kind of international, global kind of problem, that whether there should be support for gay marriage or not, given that marriage reiterates some of the patriarchal, heteronormative structures that apparently the queer, you know, lives are trying to interrogate and overturn. And yet, of course, there are arguments for gay marriage as well. So I think these are things that we consider. It's not as if every gay couple wants to be butch and femme or take on certain roles. So I think, but these questions are continually, I think, circulating. So it's a good point to bring up.
Hi, I'm talking to the person who just posed the question about casteism and gender. Yeah. So basically, sorry, but my knowledge is not that thorough. I'm just like talking from like basic social experiences that I have around. I don't think it's like casteism supersedes this gender issue and all that, because I mean everywhere you look around, no matter what caste people belong to, the moment a kid is born, the kid at first. The sex is obviously determined afterwards, but very early as like the kid actually starts speaking or whatever, you find glimpses of how the kid is trying to fit into a role of its gender, of being a daughter, being a son, and that I think goes beyond caste. It goes around in all the castes that we see around. So hence I don't think casteism supersedes the gender issue. Yeah, that's it.
बहुत सारे सवाल आ रहे हैं, और थोड़ा ब्रीफली आप लोग पूछें, क्योंकि और भी सवाल हैं और एक्सप्लेनेशन भी चाहिए.
Hi Brinda, hi Sanjay. So my question is actually will be like, I'll ask that post this comment, I feel. So since you have raised the point of masculinity, Sanjay, and of course gender has always been with us, what my comment is, I see a certain sense of absence of history while we talk about it. So, and by history I don't mean like movements which started on in modern India and stuff like modern India. But then being a history student myself, I feel that a lot of topics have been connected. You know, we always connect things to the religious things, especially the ancient period of our history. So when we talk about masculinity, you talk about certain conventional masculinities which actually, you know, are being favored by certain ancient religious texts and all, which many of the people actually talk about and use them in a way to circulate that this is what our grand culture has been propagating and all. But then at the same time there is also this alternate history of different religious sects as well. We very well know about this Mahishasura and Durga thing. So, you know, why is it not that those kind of cultures which are actually very prominent in their own regions are not being propagated in a way? And how come history, which is very much belongs to us, and we belong to history as such as well, like in the present way as well, why is it that that subject has been so sacrificed from the present? Like, I would like to see a certain kind of, you know, connection from between this particular moment, the present, and the connection between how did it come along, like from the ancient times, like, you know, the actual texts which have been there, and not just Ramayana, although Ramayana also has a lot of alternative characters which talk about, you know, other aspects of societies which might be very, very problematic to the recent fundamentalist thoughts. But then they are not very popular. So how can we as sociologists or political identities can actually incorporate our historical sense to the, you know, current situations and all? That's it.
पूछ लीजिए बहुत briefly, क्योंकि काफी सारे सवाल हैं.
I'll quickly ask a couple of questions to both the speakers. Sanjay, thank you so much for that that concept of Modi masculinity, and I think it's a very important reference. But also, I think to look at this idea of Modi masculinity as being based on a certain fiction of celibacy, right? So, which of course is a complete fiction, but nevertheless a certain fiction of celibacy, right? So, and a certain non-reproductive masculinity, therefore, right? So isn't the Sanghi idea of masculinity also a certain non-reproductive, let's say, containment of sexual energies, which can then be forced and channelized in, let's say, social, cultural forms of violence, right? So that kind of is something that was kind of bothering me. Brinda, thank you so much. As you rightly said, the age of neoliberal capital has, of course, kind of, in a way, right, so has kind of tied the feminist struggle with the capitalist moment, right, and in a very oppressive fashion altogether, right? So are you saying that now, therefore, right, and this is something that, of course, Nancy Fraser also talks about in the Fortunes of Feminism, right? So is it therefore now imperative for the Indian women's movement to return to, let's say, the wages for housework kind of moment, right? So that Federici moment, right? So where we need to, in order to move away from, let's say, the neoliberal understanding of let's say, feminist liberation, right? So do we need to return to that housework economy moment? Right? And the second question is that I'm a little uncomfortable with the idea of solidarity, because it often tends to homogenize, right? So it often tends to kind of look beyond the specifics of the situation, which you kind of touched upon, right? And which is possibly the reason why we need to enter into an intimacy of struggles rather than just a solidarity across struggles. Thank you so much.
Yeah, please, Savali.
I'll just answer. That was a lovely phrase. The intimacy of struggle is absolutely right, Devalito. I think again, because I was glossing over, but when I did say solidarity alliances along with differences and disquiet, and I was actually hoping to think about how it's possible to have solidarities despite differences to some extent, but also to keep the differences alive. And which is also then pertaining to what we were thinking about in terms of exceptionalism of the space, that while we hold on to the kind of energies that we are generating, that we also think in terms of how to interrogate it, etc. I'm afraid I'm not so well versed in the economy question, so as to be able to speculate as to. You tell me, perhaps you're better, sort of, you might have thought through it better. I'm not sure that going back to the housework pay moment is the answer, but certainly that there should be a recognition of all kinds of domestic work in some way or the other, not perhaps directly in terms of pay for the number of hours you put in, but a recognition in terms of the gender dynamics of what one does. That's as much as I would be able to say. But not, I mean, Nancy Fraser is, of course, as you're sort of hinting at, is sort of passé, right? So we have to think about newer ways of economy and liberalism and gender. But more than that, immediately I wouldn't be able to say. Yeah.
Maybe we'll shift the board. I think the first question is about how to recuperate those other alternate histories of masculinities, might be religion. I have to say I'm not completely convinced by that, because what separates us from the era of the Ramayana is the entire history of wars, industrial revolution, agriculture, history of education, etc. that makes us, and history of class, history of capital, that makes us something now that it is very difficult to read back into sort of an ancient Indian period. So while I am completely in sympathy with the point of view that, like, one of the things I have to say personally really annoys me, although I love Sufi music, every time there is some kind of problem, people hold a Sufi music concert. A medieval poetry tradition, as wonderful as it is to listen to, cannot solve the contemporary problems of gender, class, caste, etc. So we need to understand how the present interprets and builds the present. So while I'm completely sympathetic as to looking at the past and drawing something from it, I'm not actually very, it's like, I'm not altogether convinced that is something that we should be doing, that it is possible to do. That it is very much optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect. I think we need to get a sense of the present, because the present is separated by thousands of social and political processes from the ancient, and it is the present we need to understand in the present. And in terms of the second question, I think you articulated very well your discomfort. I don't think I can add anything to it. That about non-reproductive masculinity और उसका रिश्ता हिंसा से क्या है, and I think some work has been done on it, and I think that's, there's a very significant, and with Indian context, I think it's sort of lost somewhat away, the idea of semen anxiety, the loss of semen and what that means in terms of loss of masculine self, and how that is then sought to be saved, stored, and then converted into more useful activities, perhaps like violence.